My adult daughter moved back home for a few months, 14 months ago, and still hasn't started job hunting. I want to start by saying that I never once resented helping my daughter. When Olivia called me crying in January of last year, telling me her lease was ending and she'd lost her marketing job in a round of layoffs, I told her to come home without a second of hesitation, the way any mother would. What I didn't expect was that 14 months later, I would be sitting at my own kitchen table trying to figure out how to ask my 26-year-old daughter when, exactly, she planned to start looking for work again, and bracing myself for how that question might land, because somewhere in those 14 months, asking it had started to feel like it required courage I wasn't sure I had. My name is Linda, and I'm 57 years old, and I want to be honest about something before I tell you the rest of this. I love my daughter Olivia completely, and nothing in this story is meant to suggest otherwise. She is smart, funny, was genuinely good at her job before the layoff, and has been, for most of her life, the kind of daughter who didn't give me much to worry about. This isn't a story about a difficult relationship between us. It's a story about how a temporary arrangement quietly stopped being temporary, and how long it took me to actually say something about it. Olivia lived in Columbus for 4 years after college, working as a marketing coordinator for a mid-sized retail company, sharing an apartment with a roommate, building what looked, from the outside, like a perfectly normal early career life. Then, in January of last year, the company went through a round of layoffs that hit her entire department, and within the same month, her roommate announced she was moving in with her boyfriend, which meant Olivia's lease, which had been month to month for the final stretch, was ending right alongside her job. She called me on a Tuesday evening, and I remember the particular quality of her voice on that call. Not hysterical, but flat in a way that worried me more than crying would have. The voice of someone who has been holding herself together for the sake of a phone call and isn't sure how much longer she can manage it. "I don't know what to do, Mom," she said. "I lost my job and my apartment in the same 2 weeks. I don't even know where to start." "Come home," I said, without hesitation, because that is what I would have said in that moment regardless of any of what came after. "Just come home for a while. We'll figure it out. Just for a few months," she said, "until I get back on my feet." "Of course," I said. "However long you need." I want to tell you about the first few months, because they genuinely went the way I think most people would expect a situation like this to go. Olivia moved back into her old bedroom, which my husband Frank and I had converted into a half-office, half-guest room after she left for college, and we shifted things around to make space for her again. She applied for jobs steadily through February and March, had a few promising interviews that didn't pan out, and seemed by every measure I could see to genuinely be trying. The job market for marketing roles, I want to acknowledge honestly, was not easy during that stretch. Several of her former colleagues from the layoff were also searching, and from what Olivia told me, most of them were taking months to land anything comparable to what they'd had before. I didn't think there was anything unusual happening in those early months. This looked like a normal, if difficult, period of unemployment that any reasonable person might go through. By the summer, though, I started noticing something shift slowly, in a way that's hard to pin to any single moment. The job applications became less frequent. Olivia had picked up a part-time job at a coffee shop near our house in April, which I thought was a sensible bridge, something to bring in a little income and structure her days while she kept searching for something in her actual field. But as the months went on, the coffee shop job seemed to become less of a bridge and more of a destination in itself. And the marketing job search that had been steady in February and March became something she mentioned less and less when I asked about it. "How's the job search going?" I asked one evening in July over dinner. "It's going," she said. "I sent a few applications out this week. Anything promising?" "Not really," she said. And the conversation moved on to something else, the way conversations between a mother and a 26-year-old daughter often do when neither person particularly wants to dig further into something uncomfortable. I think the moment I actually started paying close attention, rather than just generally noticing, was in September, when Frank mentioned something at dinner that stopped me mid-bite. "Olivia asked me for a ride to work today because her car wouldn't start," he said. "I had to leave early for my own meeting, so I just gave her the money for an Uber instead." "How much was it?" I asked. "About $15. He said, then added almost as an afterthought, "She does that a lot, actually. Asks for small amounts here and there. Gas money. An Uber. Something for groceries when she's between paychecks." I sat with that for a moment, doing some uncomfortable math in my head. Olivia's coffee shop job, as far as I understood it, paid reasonably for part-time work, and she wasn't paying rent, wasn't covering groceries beyond occasionally picking something up, wasn't contributing to utilities. I had assumed, without ever quite confirming it, that whatever she was earning was either going towards savings for when she eventually moved out again, or at minimum covering her own smaller expenses without needing supplemental help from us. "How often is a lot?" I asked Frank. He thought about it. "Maybe once a week, sometimes more." I didn't say anything something else that evening, but I started paying closer attention after that. In a way I'm not entirely proud of, like not snooping exactly, but noticing things I'd been letting pass without examination. The coffee shop schedule that seemed to have her working 3, sometimes 4 shifts a week, never full-time. The laundry that was still 8 months in, mine to manage alongside everyone else's, because Olivia's schedule was just so unpredictable. The dishes that accumulated in her room rather than the kitchen, the general sense that the temporary arrangement had, without anyone deciding it explicitly, becomes simply how things were now. I want to tell you about the conversation I had with my sister Carol in October, because it was the first time I said any of this out loud to another person, and saying it out loud made me understand how much had shifted without my fully registering it. She's been home 10 months. Carol said, after I'd walked her through the general shape of things. And she's working part-time at a coffee shop and asking you and Frank for gas money. When you say it like that, it sounds worse than it feels day to day, I said, which was true. Living inside a slow change is different from hearing it summarized. How does it feel day to day? Carol asked. I thought about that honestly. I think it feels like I keep almost saying something and then deciding it's not the right moment because she seems stressed, or because we had a nice dinner and I don't want to ruin it, or because I remember how scared she sounded on that first phone call and I don't want to make her feel like I've stopped caring about that fear just because some time has passed. Has the fear actually stayed the same as it was on that first call? Carol asked. Or has something else replaced it? I didn't have a good answer for that in the moment, but the question stayed with me for weeks afterward, because I think some part of me already suspected the honest answer, and didn't yet know what I was going to do about it. I want to tell you about the week before I actually sat down with Olivia, because I think the build-up matters as much as the conversation itself. I talked to Frank first, on a Sunday afternoon while Olivia was at a coffee shop shift. We sat in the living room, and I laid out everything I'd been noticing. The slowed job search, the small regular requests for money, the laundry, the general sense that 14 months had quietly become an indefinite arrangement without anyone deciding that on purpose. I've noticed it too, Frank said, which surprised me a little because we hadn't really discussed it as directly as I'd just discussed it with Carol. I think I kept telling myself it would shift on its own, that she'd get frustrated enough with the coffee shop schedule, or with asking us for gas money, that she'd push harder on the marketing search again without us having to say anything. And has that happened? No, he said. I don't think it has. I think we need to actually talk to her, I said. Not as a punishment, not as kicking her out, but I think we need an actual conversation about what the plan is, because right now I don't think there is one. And I think the absence of a plan is starting to feel normal to her in a way that worries me. Frank agreed, and we decided to talk to her together, on a weekend evening when none of us had anywhere else to be, rather than springing it on her during a rushed weeknight dinner. I want to be honest that I rehearsed what I wanted to say more than once in the days leading up to that Saturday. I am not, by nature, someone who confronts things directly and comfortably. I think that's part of why 14 months had passed before I said anything substantial. But I also understood, the more I thought it through, that continuing not to say anything wasn't actually kindness. It was avoidance dressed up as patience, and at some point the two stopped being the same thing. We sat down with Olivia after dinner that Saturday, and I started as gently as I could manage. We want to talk to you about how things have been going, I said, not to upset you, but it's been 14 months since you moved back, and I think we need to actually talk honestly about where things stand. Olivia's expression shifted immediately, a kind of bracing I recognized, the look of someone who has been waiting for a conversation she didn't want to have. Is this about the money? She asked. I know I've been asking for help with little stuff. I can stop doing that. It's not just about the money, I said. Though I do think we need to talk about that too. It's more that I've noticed the job search seems to have slowed down a lot, and I want to understand what's actually happening, because from where I'm sitting, it feels like things have settled into a pattern that wasn't what we talked about when you first moved back. I am looking, Olivia said, though something in her voice told me she heard how thin that sounded even as she said it. When's the last application you sent out? I asked as gently as I could manage, though I knew the question itself would feel pointed, regardless of tone. She was quiet for a long moment. I don't know exactly, she said. A while ago, I think. The market's been really discouraging, Mom. Every time I apply to something, either I don't hear back at all, or I get to a final round and someone with more experience gets it instead. After a while, it just started feeling pointless to keep trying. I want to walk through this part carefully, because I think it's the moment where the conversation could have gone in a few different directions, and I tried hard to choose the direction that was honest without being cruel. I understand that the search has been discouraging, I said. Job hunting in a tough market is genuinely hard, and I don't want to minimize that. But I think there's a difference between the search being hard and the search essentially stopping. And I think what's actually happened is closer to the second thing, even if it didn't feel like a decision in the moment. So what? You want me to just take any job, even something that has nothing to do with my degree? She asked, and I could hear something defensive creeping into her voice now. I think I want us to talk about what the actual plan is, I said. Whether that's continuing to look for marketing roles specifically, even if it takes longer, or whether it makes sense to pick up more hours at the coffee shop in the meantime, or look at adjacent roles that might be easier to land right now and could still build toward what you actually want eventually. I don't have a fixed answer for you, but I think the absence of any active plan is the actual problem, more than which specific path you choose. Frank spoke up then, gently. I think what we're both noticing, he said, is that this started as a few months. It's been over a year, and somewhere in that year, it seems like the day-to-day rhythm became more comfortable than the discomfort of really pushing hard on changing things. That's not a character flaw, Liv. That happens to a lot of people in your situation, but I think it needs to be said out loud because I don't think anyone's going to push back on it from inside the rhythm itself. Olivia was quiet for a long time after that, looking down at her hands, and when she finally spoke, her voice was smaller than it had been a few minutes earlier. I think I've been scared, she said. Like really scared in a way I haven't said out loud to anyone. Getting laid off felt like it proved something I was already afraid of, that I wasn't actually that good at my job, that the only reason I'd been doing fine was luck. And every rejection since then has kind of confirmed that fear a little more. At some point, it just felt safer to stop trying as hard, because if I'm not really trying, then the rejections don't mean as much. I know that doesn't make sense as a strategy, but that's honestly what's been happening. I felt something in my chest soften hearing that, because it reframed the previous 14 months in a way I hadn't fully considered. Not laziness exactly, though I'll admit that word had crossed my mind more than once in recent months, but something closer to a quiet, ongoing fear that had calcified into avoidance without Olivia fully recognizing it happening to herself. That actually helps me understand a lot, I said. I think what I need you to hear is that I'm not asking you to have all the answers right now, tonight, but I am asking that we figure out an actual plan together, with some real structure to it, instead of just letting the months keep passing the way they have been. We spent another hour that evening actually working through what a plan could look like. I want to be honest that this wasn't a perfectly smooth conversation from that point forward. There were still moments of defensiveness, a moment where Olivia said she felt like we were treating her like a teenager instead of an adult, which I acknowledged was a fair feeling even as I held my ground on the substance of what we were asking. What we landed on, by the end of that evening, was something concrete. Olivia would commit to a specific number of marketing applications per week, not as a punishment, but as a structure to actually rebuild the habit that had quietly eroded over the past several months. She'd also look into a part-time career counseling service through her old university's alumni network, something neither of us had thought of until that conversation, which offered free resume reviews and interview coaching for graduates regardless of how many years out they were. And we talked carefully about a small monthly contribution toward household expenses, not a full rent payment, but something that acknowledged she was an adult living in our home rather than a guest passing through. I think I needed someone to actually say all this out loud, Olivia said near the end of the conversation. I think I knew somewhere that things had drifted, but it's easier to not look at something directly when nobody's making you look at it. I want to tell you about that Saturday we spent practicing interview questions, because it ended up mattering more to me than I expected it to. Olivia came downstairs with a legal pad full of notes she'd put together herself, research on the company, anticipated questions based on the job description, a list of her own accomplishments from her previous role that she'd apparently had to work hard to remember how to talk about with any confidence. We sat at the kitchen table, the same table where we'd had the harder conversation 6 weeks earlier, and I asked her questions the way I used to before her college interviews, watching her answers get steadier and more specific each time we ran through them. You're better at this than you think you are, I told her, after about the fourth practice round, when her answer about handling a difficult client situation had gone from vague and apologetic to specific and genuinely impressive. I think I forgot that, she said. Somewhere in the last year, I think I just started believing the rejections were telling me something true about my actual abilities, instead of just being what rejections are, a mix of timing, fit, and luck that doesn't always have much to do with whether you're good at something. I want to be honest that this insight didn't arrive in a single dramatic moment. It built slowly over the weeks following our initial conversation, through smaller exchanges like this one, through Olivia gradually reconnecting with the part of herself that had been genuinely good at her job before the layoff knocked. something loose in her confidence that took longer to repair than the actual job search itself. She got the job about 2 weeks after that interview. I remember exactly where I was when she called to tell me, in the laundry room, of all places, still doing more of her laundry than I'd like to admit even at that point. Though that too would change soon enough. I got it. "Mom," she said, and her voice had a quality I hadn't heard in well over a year, something close to the way she'd sounded calling me with good news back in her Columbus days, before any of this started. "I'm so proud of you," I said, and I meant it completely, not just because of the job itself, but because of everything underneath it, the fear she'd finally named out loud, the months of quiet avoidance she'd had to recognize in herself before she could actually start moving through it. The new role wasn't a perfect match to her previous position. Slightly lower starting salary, a longer commute, a smaller company than she'd worked for before, but it was real full-time, in her actual field, and most importantly, it represented Olivia having pushed through the fear that had kept her circling in place for so long, rather than simply waiting for circumstances to change around her. I want to address something honestly here, because I think it matters for understanding what this whole period actually taught me, beyond just the relief of Olivia finding work again. I don't think the 14 months were entirely Olivia's responsibility to have managed differently, and I don't think they were entirely mine either. I think what happened is something I suspect happens in a lot of families, when an adult child moves back home during a genuine crisis. The crisis is real and deserves compassion, but compassion without any structure or check-in points can quietly drift into something that stops serving anyone well, including the person it was meant to help. I talked about this with Carol again, a few weeks after Olivia started the new job, trying to make sense of the whole arc of it. "I think I was so afraid of seeming unsupportive," I told her, "that I let support mean never bringing up anything uncomfortable, even as it became clearer and clearer that something needed to be said. I think real support would have meant having that conversation around month 4 or 5. Not month 14. You had it eventually," Carol said, "and from what you're telling me, it actually worked because you didn't lead with anger. You led with genuine curiosity about what was actually happening underneath the surface, and that's what got you to the real conversation, instead of just a fight about chores and money." I think that's true, and I think it's the part of this I'm most glad about in hindsight, that when I finally did say something, I tried to ask rather than accuse, to understand rather than simply demand change. I don't think that made the conversation easy, but I think it made it productive in a way a more reactive version of the same conversation might not have been. Olivia moved into her own apartment about 4 months after starting the new job, once she'd built up enough savings and stability to feel confident about it. I want to be honest that there was a strange mix of feelings the day we helped her move her things out. Genuine relief, certainly after the strain of those later months, but also something close to grief. The recognition that this particular chapter, 14 months of her being back under our roof, was actually over now, for better and for worse. "Thank you for finally saying something," she told me. The day of the move, both of us tired from carrying boxes, sitting on her now empty old bedroom floor for a moment before heading back out to the car. I think if you hadn't, I might still be stuck in the same pattern. I don't think I would have pulled myself out of it on my own, not because I'm lazy, but because fear is really good at disguising itself as just needing more time. "I think I needed to hear that you needed it said," I told her. "I spent a long time worried that saying anything would feel like I'd stopped supporting you. I don't think I understood until we actually had that conversation that sometimes the most supportive thing isn't staying quiet. It's saying the hard thing clearly enough that the other person can actually hear it and do something with it. I think about that first phone call sometimes, the flat, worried voice telling me she didn't know where to start, and the version of her who called me from the grocery store parking lot, all of 14 months and one honest conversation later, sounding like herself again for the first time in a long while. I don't think every family handles a situation like this the same way, and I don't think there's a single right number of months before a conversation like ours needs to happen. What I do think, looking back, is that the conversation itself mattered more than the timing of it, that waiting 14 months instead of 4 cost something, in terms of how comfortable the old pattern had become for both of us, but that the conversation, once we finally had it, honestly and without blame, was what actually moved things forward, not the passage of time on its own. Olivia calls most Sundays now, from her own apartment, telling me about her week, her new coworkers, the small, ordinary details of a life that's genuinely her own again. Last week, she mentioned, almost in passing, that she'd started putting a little money into savings each month, the first time she's been able to do that since before the layoff. "That's wonderful, honey," I said, and I meant it completely. Not because of the savings account itself, though that mattered too, but because of everything it represented about how far she'd come from that frightened, flat-voiced phone call 14 months and a lifetime ago.